The United States of America has never seen a presidential election quite like the one that just ended, or a president-elect quite like the one who's about to take office. Here to make sweet sense of it all, one of the nation's finest political reporters, the Washington Post's Robert Costa on Uncommon Knowledge now. Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Robert Costa grew up in Yardley, Pennsylvania, just up the Delaware from Philadelphia. He earned his bachelor's degree in American Studies at Notre Dame and a master's degree in politics at Cambridge. Mr. Costa has worked at the Wall Street Journal and at National Review, and 3 years ago he joined the Washington Post. He appears frequently on television, so frequently on television that the week after the election, I think I caught you on Charlie Rose 3 nights in a row. Could have been more. In the words of one media critic, Mr. Costa is omnipresent. And to prove it, he's here. Bob, welcome.
Great to be here.
Bob Costa in the Washington Post in early October. I am quoting something that you published just 2 months ago as we record this. Quote, "The Republican Party tumbled toward anarchy Monday over its presidential nominee after Friday's publication of a 2005 video showing him bragging about sexual assault. Clinton surged to an 11 percentage point lead. Trump ally William J. Bennett was pained as he spoke about the nominee. It's a shame, a crying shame, but he can't win," Bennett said. "He should step down." Close quote. Just 2 months ago. What happened? Get us from that moment to election night.
Well, I remember filing that exact story on Friday night, and the person who broke that story, David Farenthold, was sitting right next to me as he broke it in the Washington Post newsroom. But I think the most important story is the story I published the day after. So I go into the newsroom on Saturday after the story breaks on Friday.
Story breaks on a Friday. Go ahead.
Breaks on a Friday, go in on a Saturday, it's an empty newsroom. And I'm thinking to myself, the whole party's calling me and saying, Trump's got to get out. It's over. This tape is horrible. And Trump's, from what I hear, up in Trump Tower, watching television alone in his apartment. And so I call him up. I call up Trump the day after the tape breaks, and I get him on his cell phone immediately. And I say, "Are you watching TV?" He's watching TV. And I said, "Are you going to quit the race?" Because he had read the story, he'd read every other story. And he said, "Costa, I will never withdraw. I will never quit." He started talking about life. I put this all in the Sunday paper, about how he has been through so much in his business, in his career, in his life, personal life, that he's not going to quit. And so that ended up being the Sunday front. I will never withdraw, from the cell phone of Donald Trump to the Washington Post on Saturday afternoon. And I think it really underscored to me his defiance in spite of everything swirling around him. Everyone thought he would lose, thought it was over.
You just turned 31. You've known Donald Trump for 5 or 6 years. Mm-hmm. How did you, a cub reporter in his mid-20s, get to know Donald Trump? How did it come about?
Well, before I joined the Post, as you said, I was at National Review.
Right.
And when Trump was doing the birther episode and pursuit of whatever he was doing, we covered it a little bit. We were skeptical of what he was doing at National Review, but we covered it. When he was flirting with the presidential run, we covered it. And I took it seriously because I saw, especially post-President George W. Bush, this vacuum in the Republican Party. I'm not an academic, I'm not an expert, but I saw this vacuum of power. I saw a Republican Party that in many ways had splintered apart. And then my own instincts told me that there was an opening possibly for populism. And so in Trump, this celebrity populist figure, even though he didn't have a coherent ideology, I thought, this is someone I should pay attention to. This is someone who actually could rise. And I benefited not so much by my own acumen or clever scheming as a reporter, but not many national reporters covering politics wanted to talk to Trump. He had flirted with politics before, and it was seen as a not very serious pursuit. But I always kept it on my stove, in a sense, as a reporter, saying this is something that could grow, could become something.
And so how did you actually get to know him?
He was very easy to get to know. It wasn't that hard.
Were you in New York or Washington? Which office
I was in
were you?
Washington at the time.
Okay.
But I really started to cover Trump closely in 2013. And he had decided to go to Iowa. And it got very little coverage. It was laughed at. But I spoke to him in 2013, and I put a story in National Review. You can go still find it online. Trump thinks about 2016 bid, heads to Iowa. Even at National Review, there were discussions then in 2013, should we actually publish this? But I talked to Trump at length in 2013, and he was different than the Trump I had encountered in 2011. When 2011, when he was thinking about running for president, it was clearly a playful flirtation. It was not that serious.
Right.
In 2013, I saw him in a different way, thinking about the country falling apart in his eyes. He thought the country was broken. He thought the political class was out of touch. And it just seemed more real to me compared to what I had seen in 2011.
So Donald Trump in 2013 struck you, Bob Costa, as a serious man. And he was easy to reach? Well, you developed a relationship. I mean, you now have the ability to call him on this. Well, who knows, after now the National Security Agency may be monitoring your calls. But so you could walk up to him. You could get to know. Do you feel you got to know him? You're a professional. You're a reporter. But did you get to know him?
Sure. And he's someone who likes to talk. And he was easy to get in touch with because a reporter can call his assistant, Rona, at Trump Tower, Rona Graff. She's been with him forever. And he's usually at his office. He doesn't use a computer, doesn't use email. He's someone who loves the phone, loves to talk on the phone, usually puts it on speaker, enjoys just talking, being in his office on the 26th floor, looking out over Central Park and having conversations. And sometimes I would call him, it would be for 5-10 minutes, it'd be for half an hour, and I would try to get minor scoops on what he was up to. And it really just kind of built as a reporter-source relationship up until early 2015, when I said to myself, and I told my editors, this is very serious, he's thinking about running for president, and we put it on the front page.
And you did not, not even sure how to frame the question exactly, you did not condescend to him.
No.
As you talked to him, you did not find yourself saying in the back of your mind, how did this guy find himself on the 26th floor of a building he built? Where's the business mind here? The sense of intelligence was obvious to you? No gap between your sense of the man you were talking to and what he seemed to have accomplished?
I was just curious. One thing I have written on my desk at the Washington Post is assume nothing. Because sometimes when I was growing up and I was reading different things, I always felt like the reporters were assuming different things about political figures. And in fact, another candidate I've gotten along with as a reporter in terms of having an ability to have a conversation with them and talking to is Bernie Sanders. And it's because I think the same approach I take to Trump is I want to learn about these people. I want to get inside of their world, share more information, be tough and be aggressive. But also sometimes the job as a reporter is to listen, and to see what's going on and to share it. And I've done that with almost everyone I've covered. I try to, at least.
Okay. So solve a puzzle for us. He has been a New Yorker all his life. He attended an Ivy League university, University of Pennsylvania, in your home state. He's a billionaire. He was born into a wealthy family, and he is now a billionaire. And yet Donald Trump connected with working people in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan enough to turn those three states and give him the presidency. How could this rich Ivy Leaguer do that?
Well, whenever I get this question from people, I usually say, have you ever watched The Apprentice?
No.
And that tells you a lot. Most people haven't watched The Apprentice if they're a part of a certain educated Washington, California, and it was a show that had.
See, Costa, you don't condescend to Trump, but you're condescending to Robinson.
I'm not trying to condescend. My point is, the reason I say have you watched The Apprentice is not to condescend, but The Apprentice was revealing of how someone who had a blue collar vernacular but a billionaire lifestyle could actually appeal to a large slice of the country. And I used to not watch. I didn't watch The Apprentice. I feel
better. Okay, I'm off the hook.
Okay.
All right.
I didn't watch it. I wasn't interested. I don't like reality television. But when I started paying attention to Trump, I started watching a few episodes, and I said, oh, I get what he's up to. I mean, he presented himself as an everyman, he was the billionaire, how a blue-collar guy would be if he had $1 billion. Right. He would have the gold, and he was so self-assertive, he was confident, he had swagger. It was an act, a performance, and it was not just the money. And so I always try to say, if you don't understand Trump, read his books, but also watch The Apprentice, because that laid the foundation for the public persona that we saw in 2016.
All right. Two quotations, Bob. CBS correspondent Leslie Stahl on Charlie Rose's show. This is a couple of weeks ago, right after the election. She's discussing with Charlie Rose her 60 Minutes interview with Trump. Quote, I saw a man who was having the weight of what he's getting into hitting him. He's the leader of the free world, and there's no question that he's feeling it. No question, close quote. That's one. Here's two. David Remnick in The New Yorker, and now he's reporting on the president-elect's meeting with the media on November 22nd. Quote, Trump showed no signs of having been sobered or changed by his elevation to the country's highest office. Rather, said one attendee, he is the same blustering, bluffing blowhard as he was during the campaign. Close quote. What is the president-elect's state of mind?
Well, the image that still sticks with me is on election night. That face of his when he came out to the podium, that was an emotional Trump, and I've never seen that face from Donald Trump in the years knowing him until I saw him on election night. He was someone, I don't know if the word is humbled because I don't know what's inside of his head, but he was moved by the moment, and I've never seen him truly moved by anything, but he was moved by that. His face was welled up with emotion, but he's still Trump. I think Remnick's onto something. I think when he brought the network executives in after the election, he gave it right to their face. He doesn't care for them. He doesn't feel like he needs them. And he had no remorse in saying that.
Okay. So that's the president-elect. I'd like to ask what the people around him tell us about what we're all in for during the Trump administration. Your colleagues Philip Rucker, how's
Rucker.
That? Philip Rucker and Mike DeBonis?
DeBonis, sure.
Okay, Philip Rucker and Mike DeBonis in the Post. They're reporting on the president-elect's decision to nominate retired Marine General John Kelly as Secretary of Homeland Security, and this is after he's chosen Lieutenant General Mike Flynn as National Security Advisor and Marine Corps General James Mattis as Secretary of Defense. Quote, Trump's choice of Kelly has intensified worries among some members of Congress and national security experts that the new administration's policies may be shaped disproportionately by military commanders, close quote. 1, 2, 3 generals named, another couple we hear are under consideration. What's with Donald Trump and generals?
Well, he's always had a fascination with the military, and it goes back to his time at New York Military Academy. He's sent there as a teenager. He doesn't fight in Vietnam.
Is it upstate? Where is that located?
Yeah, it's upstate from New York City.
Okay, all right.
And he loves it at New York Military Academy. He loves the culture there. He was a successful student in terms of doing the different activities based on all the testimony from his former classmates.
Got good grades, good athlete.
And he loved the lifestyle. He did not go to military school for college or enter the military, but he's always had an appreciation for strong men, for the toughness. One of the things that's really telling when he talks about General Mattis, he uses the nickname Mad Dog. And people in Trump's inner circle tell me he's always saying, I just love Mad Dog, Mad Dog. And I think that nickname actually may have helped in a strange way and maybe an untold way, that Trump wants people around him who project what he thinks is military-style leadership, which is authority, leadership. And I'm just not surprised at all. He's not thinking about the worry or the concern of too many generals around him.
Okay, so let's stick with James Mad Dog Mattis for a moment. Donald Trump, conciliatory toward Putin's Russia. James Mattis, very concerned about Russian policies in Syria, Ukraine, and the Baltics. And on the record as saying so. Donald Trump, determined to cancel Obama's nuclear deal with Iran. James Mattis, intent, again, on the record as saying so, on making that deal work. So what does that tell us about Donald Trump? Secretary of Defense is one of the 3 or 4 most important jobs in the cabinet, and Trump has, I mean, my feeling, you know Donald Trump, but my feeling just looking at him on camera, when James Mattis is with him, he's enjoying himself. He likes James Mattis.
Really likes him.
Does this mean policy doesn't matter to Trump? Does it mean that James Mattis is already giving him something of an education? That he's what does it mean? What does this tell us?
Well, Trump doesn't have a core ideology on a lot of these issues. And he has instincts, but he's willing to be convinced. And I heard when he spoke with Mattis, when he's spoken with different Secretary of State candidates, he's open to conversations about the issues. Now, that may make some people alarmed, but others see in Trump a president who's going to be willing to bring in a lot of different opinions and hear them out on foreign policy. He does not have a coherent foreign policy that he wants to make a doctrine yet.
So, okay, I think we all are trying to figure out how to think about Donald Trump. And you mentioned a moment ago that The Apprentice is an important part of understanding the public persona. In his approach to policy, what do we think of? Do we think of the businessman who in the middle phase of his career built one big building in Manhattan after another, brings in the architect? He's not an architect. He doesn't know weight loads and which material. But he has an instinct, what he likes. He wants something that makes a statement. And, okay, architect, let's talk.
Right.
Is that the approach?
I think so.
In other words, he understands expertise. He has his instincts, but he's willing to modify specific decisions in the presence of expertise.
And he's very willing to delegate to experts. I think a key example to look at is Trump's trip to Mexico during the campaign, hatched in part thanks to Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, Steve Bannon, his chief strategist. And a lot of that trip was about the theater of politics and the theater of foreign policy. And I hear both on domestic policy, when he's talking with congressional leaders, and on foreign policy. Trump wants things that are fast-paced. He doesn't want to be seen as a president who's slow-acting. And he also wants to be at the center of decisions. So on a foreign policy issue like Russia, if he's making a trip there, he wants to be on the red carpet. He wants to fly in with the plane. He wants to be meeting with the heads of state. But on the policy, he's going to listen to Mattis and whoever he picks as Secretary of State. It's about the presentation for Trump. You see this throughout his career. The brand matters for Trump. Popularity matters. The details are things that can be negotiated.
Okay, so no drama Obama is not the model here.
No, Trump loves drama and disruption. He thinks drama and disruption equal power.
Got it. And of course, in show business, they do to a large extent. All right. And I suppose in real estate, there's such a large component of real estate in the city of New York that's a political component. You have to be famous and wealthy and perceived as, okay, all right. I'm starting. Thank you, Bob. You're good at what you do here. The inner circle, you just mentioned, well, let's come to Jared Kushner in a moment. Steve Bannon, whom you've known for a long time, Reince Priebus. I've met Steve Bannon, but not for years. I've chatted with Reince Priebus over the phone, but I really don't know these guys. And yet, so I'm layman, and I look at them and say, whoa, these are two completely different kinds of human beings. How do these people work together?
There's always going to be some creative tension in that White House. But Bannon, I think...
It will be creative.
I think Bannon's someone who wants to do things, and Bannon has become really intrigued by global populism. By Le Pen in France, Farage in England. He made sure Farage met with Trump after the election. He sees Trump as linked to something broader in the world, this kind of working class uprising against global elites, against globalization. And that, if anything, has become part of Trump's ideology, that he can be combative and populist and nationalist, and that can be a way of governing. Bannon, though, has also been strikingly low-key in the transition period. Hasn't done television interviews, has only done a few print interviews. He knows that his influence on Trump is having Trump's ear and feeding into Trump's populism. But Bannon knows he only has so far he can go on some of these fronts. You don't see him. He entered into this power-sharing arrangement with Priebus because he knows organizationally Priebus does have the relationships with Capitol Hill. Priebus can be responsible for organizing things and making a lot of personnel decisions. But Bannon, he recognizes his role, and he thinks it's important to be there as a populist hand for Trump. But he's not dominating in some kind of unusual way. Okay.
The family, Trump seems, again, I'm the layman, you know the scene, he seems especially close to his daughter Ivanka, who is in turn married to Jared Kushner, who is in his mid-30s, the son of a major real estate family in New York. And what are their politics? Do their politics matter? Is it one of those instances where they're just concerned for the public image of the father and father? How does the family fit into this?
Jared has been at Trump's side for most of the campaign. I was on Trump's plane several times with Jared, and he'd be there sitting right next to Trump, guiding Trump. Jared's a quiet man, someone who doesn't seek the spotlight. Ivanka, in many ways, could be an informal first lady. Her politics are more moderate. She has been meeting with people like Al Gore on climate change. She's the face of the company, the future face of the company. And so she has a touch for women's issues, for the brand of the Trump company. I think that will continue. Jared's an important person next to Trump because Priebus is close to the party and Bannon is close to the grassroots and has a real creative mind in how he thinks through politics. Kushner is a liaison for a lot of foreign leaders, for people outside in the business community. If they don't know Bannon or Priebus, they can come through Jared, and Jared has he has time on his hands to build different kinds of relationships. And as I cover Trump, and I think as people think about the Trump administration, it's not so much Bannon versus Priebus, it's the three concentric circles of Kushner, Bannon, and Priebus all around Trump.
Okay, let's stick with that for just a moment. If you think of inner circles, We've got John Kennedy, his brother Bobby, whom he makes Attorney General, but they're on the phone with each other every day. He's got Ted Sorensen in the White House. And what you think here is urbane, highly educated, and intensely loyal to John Kennedy, right? Then we have Reagan, and he has that troika in the first term of Ed Meese, who is a thorough and principled conservative, and Jim Baker, who's a deal doer from Texas, and then Mike Deaver, who's the image guy and understands how the cameras should be set up and the light should be set up and so forth. And so you get, with Reagan, you get this feeling that it's a kind of practical approach even to the inner circle. He's balancing political forces. Baker can deal with Congress. Meese can bring me papers that show me what I ought to do if the politics permit me to do. Mike is going to make sure everything goes all right on the evening news that night. Okay, so what is this? In other words, Kennedy, loyalty, but a certain suavity. And Reagan, it's practical. What does this inner circle tell us about Trump?
It tells us that there's not going to be a heavy, heavy hand around Trump. They're going to people. If loyalty is important, and this is also about balancing the different circles and power circles around Trump. But Priebus, Bannon, Kushner are influential, but they're not going to be really pushing Trump in a certain direction. It means Trump wants to be the decider. Trump wants to play these people off of each other at times when he's making decisions, bring more people in. But he's not going to have someone, even like a Jim Baker around him, who's really going to push him in a certain direction on certain policies. It's Trump being disruptive, Trump being unpredictable, and having people have different duties.
Okay, so we'd all better be prepared to remain off balance for 4 years to come.
Certainly.
All right. The cabinet. Let me just name names, and we'll
Sure.
tick through this quickly. We've already talked about Jim Mattis at the Pentagon, John Kelly, Homeland Security, the Department of Education, Betsy DeVos. Comes from a very rich family, Michigan, and she is a campaigner for charter schools.
Deeply conservative. And this brings up another section of power we need to mention,
Yes.
which is Vice President Pence.
Right. Okay. Let's go ahead. Tell
He's
us.
kind of an island out into himself. He has his own conservative circle. He has his own aides, but he has earned Trump's trust and loyalty. And I find Priebus and Pence together really form a kind of Republican mainstream / conservative movement group within this Trump administration that has already been working together to get people like Betsy DeVos into education. Because Trump, being non-ideological does not mean he's against having someone with real ideology in there. And so DeVos, with all of her statements about privatization on different fronts of education, for vouchers, Trump's not thinking in policy terms, but if Priebus and Pence say this is the kind of person we want in there, okay.
And the same for Jeff Sessions. Jeff Sessions is an insider, though, too, isn't he? He's a special case.
He's interesting. I was with Sessions when he first started to get to know Trump real well in 2015, and I was in Mobile, Alabama. Sessions went onto the plane, first put on the Make America Great Again hat. And Sessions saw early on that his whole life in Congress he has spent on immigration.
Yes.
Hardline policies, not just on illegal immigration, but on limiting legal immigration. And in Trump, he saw someone who was singing his tune, and Sessions had been on the back bench, in a sense, in the Senate for a long time. And they really connected, and he came on pretty early to endorse Trump. And Rick Dearborn, who's been the chief of staff for Sessions, has been working very influential in the transition and making sure Sessions types, kind of populist conservatives like Stephen Miller, the speechwriter, and others, are in positions of prominence.
And so you've got Betsy DeVos, thoroughgoing conservative education. She's not going to coddle the teachers' unions. She's going to take them on. You've got Jeff Sessions, a thorough conservative at the Department of Justice. Now tell me about Scott Pruitt, Environmental Protection Agency. Oklahoma Attorney General, now nominated to lead the Environmental Protection Agency.
I mean, I was just looking at my inbox after the announcement. I mean, every environmental group in the country, every Democrat, it's apocalyptic.
On the argument that?
He's going to rip apart the department in terms of its regulatory structure. And I think that's, again, an example of how Trump is willing to have conservative ideologues with him in the administration, and it's in part because people like Priebus, Bannon, and Pence, and Kushner understand that he needs to give a lot to the right to keep the right with him. And they don't. And Trump's fine. Trump wants to get rid of regulations. He just didn't have. I don't think when he was running for president, he would never talk to me or others. Maybe he had it at plan. about what he wanted to do with EPA. But he would have talked about, I just want to get rid of all these regulations in a broad way. And people say, oh, well, Trump doesn't have depth. He didn't have a plan. True, but when the time came to make decisions, he's putting in these deeply conservative people.
So, Bob's deeply conservative people, is there anything you would like to say in particular to your fellow, I shouldn't say your fellow conservatives, your fellow editors at National Review who ran a cover story against Trump, to Bill Kristol of the Weekly Standard, to George Will, all these conservatives who were never Trumpers?
The hard thing for a lot of people on the right is temperament.
That's it.
Trump does not have the temperament in their minds. So when I talk to a lot of conservative leaders, Republican politicians, they can't stand that he tweets. They say, please, that's not the way this government should run. That's not the way the president should act. And they may be right. Everyone has their own case. I will say this as a reporter. When I'm out on the campaign trail, it's astounding to me how often policy doesn't come up. And it's all culture. It's all, people love the theater of Trump's tweets. They don't mind that he curses or has these. I think the country has changed, maybe for the worse, but it's changed. It's a different country, and Trump, in many ways, fits the kind of voters I met all the time.
Okay. One more cabinet appointment. Steve Mnuchin, Department of the
Trump
Treasury.
loyalist. He was always with Trump, national finance chairman for Trump. Comes out of the finance world, low key, but he was always on the plane with Trump, and he was the finance guy for the campaign.
But this is not somebody I mentioned Betsy DeVos, and you say dedicated conservative. You're not going to say that about Steve Mnuchin.
I don't know enough about Mnuchin's politics, but I will say whenever I've encountered Mnuchin, he's been working with Trump on tax cuts. So he's going to have a hand.
Okay, well, then let me ask you one question about I'm going to come back to Bob Costa and Donald Trump in a moment, but last question here about policy. We have heard Donald Trump say he wants to cut taxes and roll back regulations, pro-growth agenda. We have also heard Donald Trump talk, particularly since the election, about a gigantic amount of infrastructure spending. And then, of course, from the get-go, there's been a protectionist, let's at least call it an impulse, because he lays down a policy and then walks it back. But he's willing to slap tariffs on imports. So who's going to show up during these first 100 days? The pro-growth, tax-cutting Donald Trump, or the big government, spend a lot of money, slap tariffs on people, protectionists?
Both of them are going to show up.
Okay.
I mean, it's a strange situation. When I was on Capitol Hill in recent days, you have a lot of members saying, I don't understand. He's going to have $1 trillion or $900 billion infrastructure package, and he's also going to do all these tax cuts. I mean, that's going to put us into deficits and debt. And Trump's not thinking in those terms. He wants high growth. He wants high employment. And with infrastructure, the Trump people are making the case privately already. This is the way to get the Democrats broken apart and give them what they want. You tell a Democratic senator who's up for re-election 2018, we're going to put 3 highways in your state. You don't want the highways? And infrastructure is pure politics for Trump. It's growth. I mean, even the wall is a stimulus project, if you think about it. So you're also going to have tax cuts. You're going to have hardline immigration policy. You're going to have spending. It's not a traditional Republican government. And at the same time, you're going to have Tom Price in Health and Human Services doing a whole tax credit replacement for the Affordable Care Act. And so
Tom Price, congressman from Georgia, whom we left out, who's devoted since Obamacare was enacted, as best I can tell from looking at his record, the day after Obamacare was enacted, this congressman from Georgia began devoting himself to figuring out how to repeal it. Another instance where Donald Trump is demonstrating seriousness. He's named a guy to HHS who really will do all he can to repeal Obamacare. Sorry.
Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, the problem for many of these Republicans I'm talking to all the time is they can't swallow the fact that they're going to get everything they wanted on tax reform, stuff they've been working on for 5-10 years.
Right.
But at the same time, they're going to have to swallow a president who's battling companies individually, talking about tariffs and trade wars. It's hard for them to match these things up, but that's the reality of the Trump administration.
And that I've heard economists say, well, it's all right if he talks about tariffs, and it's all right if he puts in a few, the carrier company puts in a few museums in the Midwest, museums to the 1950s. That won't do that much harm, as long as that's not what he really means. As long as what he really means is pro-growth. But you're telling us he really means it all.
He does.
Okay.
And I know Priebus has already been told to make sure there's a list of companies that are shipping jobs overseas on Trump's desk every day.
Really?
One thing I've always learned about Donald Trump, people think this is sometimes an act for him or that this is play. This man, our new president, loves to fight. He loves to fight privately. He loves to fight publicly. And this idea that he's somehow going to retreat from these companies, I say, study Trump. Man loves to fight. He relishes this idea of fighting companies, keeping the jobs here. He probably thinks it's going to win him re-election.
Okay. Back to you and Donald Trump. Over the course of this campaign, he went through 3 campaign managers. He's up at 3 in the morning tweeting. He's taking phone calls from Bob Costa, among others. How do you cover this whole opera? I mean, just what are the nuts and bolts of covering this? I guess at your stage, because you've known him, you just call him? Is that the way it works? How do you do it?
You don't want to overdo it. It's like anything.
Okay.
You don't want to call your friends too much, or you don't want to call your sources too much. I think with Trump, I always just say, just chill out. That's what I tell my colleagues and friends. I mean, it's so easy to become overheated covering Trump. He did what now? He did this, he did that. Oh my gosh. So much is happening. You got to just take it easy. Think through what's happening. It's not about being distracted by the tweets. Cover the tweets if they're newsworthy. But always try to think about what's the big picture here? What's he really trying to do? Is it populism? Is it trying to confront a certain Republican or get Democrats rattled? Just push the media around a little bit. You just got to take it day by day. Too often, I think the coverage of Trump, it's aggressive, which is great. You need to have aggressive coverage of every candidate, and you got to give them as much scrutiny as possible. But at the same time, you have to not become over the top and getting too fussy.
Jim Rutenberg, in the Mediator column in the New York Times, quote, this is at the midway through the campaign, but this is well before the election. If you're a working journalist and you believe that Donald J. Trump is a demagogue, playing to the nation's worst racist and nationalist tendencies, of course, who wouldn't? That he cozies up to anti-American dictators and that he would be dangerous with control of the United States nuclear codes, then you have to throw out the textbook of American journalism, close quote. There he is saying, close to the beginning of the campaign, throw out the textbook, we treat Trump differently. How would you grade the media's performance overall? And let's accept you and let's accept the Washington Post,
All
everybody
right.
else.
I understand Rutenberg's point of view. It's not something I have ascribed to. I just think it's the job of the reporter to provide people with as much information as possible, to let them make the decisions. I'm never comfortable. I was never comfortable at National Review writing a column. Never did. Never wrote an editorial at National Review. I just personally have always found myself most comfortable as a reporter, which is to kind of take a mirror up and shine it and let people see what's happening. I think the media has had a difficult time, not just with Trump, but with outsiders in general, people from beyond the political class. I think Bernie Sanders was treated in the same way as Trump was treated, which was, for a long time, was just never taken seriously. It was never treated like a candidate who had an actual shot at the nomination. I think that's a mistake. I think this idea that if you don't have a certain look or you don't speak in a certain way politically, you don't use certain words or vernacular, that you're not a national candidate or can be a national candidate. It's a mistake, and it's founded on assumptions, on pure assumptions, and not much data or anything else. I just think the press, we're not the story, and we should remember that.
Okay. Here's a tweet from Donald Trump. Nobody should be allowed to burn the American flag. He retweets this. The press responds goes into a tizzy. Doesn't he understand the First Amendment? Is he unaware of Supreme Court jurisprudence? There's a famous case that's on and on and on. Mm-hmm. And then a lot of ordinary Americans say, he's got a point. I don't know about the law, but, he's got a point. The country needs to be more patriotic. Andy Ferguson, writing about all this in the Weekly Standard, quote, with a tweet here and a tweet there, Trump is happily driving a wedge between the news media and their intended customers. The dawning Trump era is pushing the mainstream press further and further to the margins, close quote. Substitute legacy, if you will, for mainstream press. These are old entities. Forgive me, I have to include the Washington Post here, but the New York Times is decades, more than a century old. These are old entities with specific patterns of thought that you were just touching on. Trump represents a challenge to their to their existence, but certainly to the way they do business now. Is that fair to say? Is it all just everybody's in a tizzy and we can all calm down and the press can go back to its job and the president will do his job. That would be one option. The other option is, no. Things are changing here. And the role of the press will be quite different by the end of 4 years of the Trump administration.
I think the role of the press has already changed. I mean, so few people in my generation in their 20s and 30s aren't reading newspapers. They're not necessarily watching the nightly news. If everything's on their phone. So the technology is changing. But in terms of the coverage, there's so many more channels out there, so many more outlets, that you have to earn every reader and viewer and keep them. And so I think the legacy media, the mainstream media, whatever you want to call it, our challenge is to make sure we're really reaching our audience and also expanding our audience. And I think the way to do that is to not look at Andy Ferguson's articles, to not become consumed by the tweets. What I'm interested in as a reporter is, when did Trump write it? Why? Who helped him with the tweet? What is this? Is it really just to play the media? Is there something else going on here? Really try to tell the backstory of what's going on. I'm not about the fuss over it. I understand there's other people in my business who do that. But I understand that the point is that we're losing our capital in a lot of ways, our influence. And I just hope the Washington Post and any other organization that we can not only just provide information, but speak to people from all walks of life about what's happening in the government and what's happening in politics. And I think that takes investigations, and it takes sometimes a tough tone in editorials or in coverage, but also you just can't be consumed by a certain worldview or that kind of thing. People just love to find out new things and have it not shaded too much one way or the other.
A couple last questions. Steve Bannon, in one of the few interviews he's given, if we deliver, the Trump administration, if we deliver, we'll get 60% of the white vote, 40% of the black and Hispanic vote, and we'll govern for 50 years, close quote. Will they deliver? So I'm not asking you to confront Steve Bannon, but the question here is, you took Donald Trump seriously before almost anybody else. Do you feel there is a prospect for one of those very rare moments in American politics, 1932 Franklin Roosevelt, 1980 Ronald Reagan, when something genuinely new is about to happen in American politics, when the Republican Party may be given a new life, he may be able to put together a new coalition, and that what will take place during these 4 years will have permanent political consequences? Or, it's just Trump, people will get tired of him, and we'll get back to normal 4 years from now?
I think the former is possible.
You do?
I think it's going to be very difficult. I think what Bannon's view is, and I've spoken to Bannon about this, and Trump, is they want the Republican Party to be the working class party. And their view is, and that's what Bannon articulated, is if the Republicans can become the working class party, then what do the Democrats have except kind of the elite, and they have some unions.
The faculty lounge.
And you've got the Democratic Party. I'm not sure the whole Republican Party is comfortable with this direction. I mean, McConnell and Ryan are not, they're for working class issues, but they're not populist in the same way Trump is. It's going to take a lot of political will from Trump, talent, to enact a legislation that keeps an agenda that keeps this party together, but also brings new people in. And Trump could be easily distracted. He can be thin-skinned. He can be erratic. He's leaving himself in some ways vulnerable on the business front. A lot of challenges for Trump. But if anyone could break apart the Republican Party and make it into some kind of working class, populist / conservative party, it would be Trump, because he's not tethered to any certain ideology or worldview. Okay, last question. White House briefing room. It has about 50 seats. I think it used to be 49 seats, about 50 seats. And those seats are assigned according to the decision of the White House Correspondents Association. The incoming administration doesn't even get to decide who sits in those seats. So it's the Washington Post has a seat, the LA Times has a seat, the New York Times, of course, CBS, NBC, on and on. And here we have a president who not only can, but does speak to the American people directly by tweeting, releasing a YouTube video. He's gone ages now without a formal press conference, and it's beginning to look as though he just doesn't think formal press conferences are necessary. Well, I think Trump would make a mistake if he didn't make. I think so. This is a so advice to the next press secretary: keep the briefing room. I mean, as recently as the administration of John Kennedy, that was a swimming pool. He could move the press back across the old executive office building. They could kick the press out of the White House. They could never have a press conference. No, I think it's a mistake for these administrations. I've seen it on Capitol Hill. If you close up to the press, you win short-term victories. You don't get bothered. You control the narrative of whatever you want to call it a little more. But in the end, you hurt yourself. I really, as a reporter, I think, and I know people think, oh, you're just arguing for more reporting. True, but I've never seen it work out for a politician to truly close up to the press. Secretary Clinton was pretty close to the press, and we never really got insights into that. And the campaigns and the people around these operations that get too much anti-press, they become so tightly wound that it just doesn't function. Politics has to have a little looseness to it. I think that Trump, he may be antagonistic toward the press, but we are the fourth estate. Maybe the legacy medias are dying in some people's view and all this, but you can't just say you can't kill the press. I mean, this is America.
Robert Costa of the Washington Post, thank you.
Thank you.
For Uncommon Knowledge in the Hoover Institution, I'm Peter Robinson. Free trade. Donald Trump has attacked it, but economists celebrate it. Now that he's become our 45th chief executive, Donald Trump can speak for himself. Here today to speak for economists, one of the nation's leading trade economists, Douglas Irwin. Uncommon Knowledge now. Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Douglas Irwin did his undergraduate work at the University of New Hampshire, then received both his MA and PhD from Columbia. He served on President Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors staff, has taught at institutions including Yale and the University of Chicago, and has been a visiting scholar at the Hoover Institution here at Stanford. For almost 2 decades now, Dr. Irwin has been a professor of economics at Dartmouth College. Among his many publications, Free Trade Under Fire, the most recent edition of which was published in 2015. Doug Irwin, welcome.
Thank you.
2 quotations. Donald Trump, I'm in favor of free trade, but I want great deals for our country, close quote. Second quotation, you, Doug Irwin, writing this past summer in Foreign Affairs, quote, Trump portrays trade as a zero-sum game. That's an understandable perspective for a casino owner, close quote. Zero-sum game, understandable for a casino owner. Explain yourself.
Well, he owns the casinos in Atlantic City and elsewhere, and if the House wins, that's because the patrons are losing. So he's counting on his benefit being extracted from the customers that come in.
Both parties do not win at the same time.
Exactly.
Got it.
People lose, the House wins.
Okay. And what's wrong with that view?
Well, it's a wrong view of international trade. It's sort of right from a business person's perspective in terms of the particular deals they're involved with. If he buys some land, someone else doesn't buy that land, so he gets to build the building. The other person loses. But international trade is a little bit different. It's an exchange between countries, producers and consumers in different regions, and both sides benefit in the aggregate from those agreements.
All right. Free trade under fire. The traditional case for free trade, very briefly, I want to take you through the case that you make in your book. The traditional case for free trade is based on the gains from specialization and exchange. Explain those terms.
No one can explain it better than Adam Smith, and I'm wearing the Adam Smith tie for you because he in The Wealth of Nations in 1776 made one of the most eloquent, powerful cases for trade that we've ever seen, and basically said countries can only become rich by specializing. The division of labor allows people and producers to specialize in certain activities, become more productive, more efficient. And international trade is just a way of extending that division of labor, not only within a country, but between countries. So if we have a lot of agricultural land and a lot of sophisticated capital, we can leverage that and use that to produce goods that other countries would want. And other countries can specialize in labor-intensive goods if they have a lot of labor. And so we can benefit by exporting things that we're good at, and we benefit also from importing things that other countries are better at than we.
And now explain this in my reading of it in any event is one of the most subtle concepts. There's really no bottom to the concept I'm about to name, but you have to understand it at least superficially to grasp free trade, and that's comparative advantage. Specialization and exchange, Adam Smith gets that. We come about a century later, or 5 or 6 decades later, to David Ricardo and comparative advantage.
Yep, as actually not too long after that. So in 1815, a little bit before then actually, David Ricardo was on vacation in Bath in England. He happened to pick up at the place that he was staying at a copy of The Wealth of Nations. And he read it. He wasn't an economist. There was no profession of economics back then. He read it, became engrossed, and he quit his day job, which is trading stocks in London, became an economist, wrote The Principles of Political Economy in 1817. And in that he has a chapter on foreign trade. And he said, Adam Smith got some things right and some things wrong on trade. He's generally right about the division of labor and specialization. But what happens if one country is better than others in doing everything? Shouldn't it do everything for itself and import nothing? Or what if you're a country that can't do anything as well as another country in terms of your productivity advantage? Shouldn't you just import from countries that do things best and not export anything yourself? So in other words, he was raising a problem that Adam Smith hadn't quite addressed.
Right.
You don't really need to understand comparative advantage to understand the gains from trade, but it is a subtle, important concept.
It's counterintuitive.
I mean, very counterintuitive,
okay.
because what it says, the bottom line is, or the counterintuitive bit, is that we should import things that we could actually produce ourselves more efficiently than other countries. So if you look at our textile industry or our apparel industry, in terms of sheer productivity, we're much more efficient than other countries. Other countries may do things less productively than we do, less efficiently, but we can still gain by specializing where our comparative advantage, our relative advantage is the greatest, and then using that to buy goods from other countries where their relative advantage is the greatest, even if we could produce those goods better ourselves. So I guess the household division of labor is sort of one way to explain this. So every household has certain tasks that they want to accomplish. House has to be cleaned, food has to be made, and what have you. And I always tell my class that my wife is superior in all those things to myself. She cleans the house better, she's a better cook.
I can testify to.
Yes. So does that mean that I should do nothing, come home, sit home, and turn on the TV while she cooks and bakes and does all these other things? That would be one way of doing it.
And by the way, that's the argument I attempt to use in my home, but go ahead.
It doesn't necessarily work because I'm a really poor cleaner, but I'm actually just marginally worse than her at cooking. So if we have a certain number of hours that we have to devote to our household activities, it makes sense. It's better for both of us if we specialize in the good where our relative advantage is the greatest. Now, once again, she has an absolute advantage over me.
Right.
But I have a comparative advantage, or I sometimes put it, my disadvantage is least in cooking. And so therefore, my margin of inferiority is least there. That's what I should be doing. And then she can do things where she far exceeds me in terms of her ability.
Okay. So we've got the case for free trade. Now, very briefly, the post-World War II regime of global free trade in which the United States is a leader in hammering out the new free trade, much freer trade after the Second World War than through the 30s and so forth, and give us the practical effects on this nation in particular of free trade over these last 7 decades. Freer and freer trade. There are negotiations that expand free trade, but what has been the practical experience?
Can I back up just for a moment?
Of course.
Because there are really 2 parts to the case for free trade. One is the one we've just been making about specialization, gains from trade. That's how, that's an important part of it. But, one of the most important concepts in economics is what's the alternative? And so the case for trade is also the case for protection is not very good. And protectionism does not serve economies well.
Protectionism is. You better just explain the basic concept here.
Raising trade barriers to interfere with trade, to limit trade in the hopes of helping the domestic economy. In other words, sort of withdrawing from world trade to some extent.
Okay.
And the U.S. has a history of actually having tried that for some period of time. And the reason I want to mention this before we got into the post-war period is because right before that, we in 1930 passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, which Ronald Reagan would occasionally talk about in his speeches because he was alive and remembered that period. And that was a period where we raised tariff barriers, trade barriers, to new high levels, right on the cusp of going into the Great Depression. And you might think that would actually help the economy. We're going to import less so we can produce more of those goods that we would have imported at home, create jobs and what have you. It doesn't work out that way. Because what happened is not only did you raise prices to consumers, but other countries retaliated against our exports. In other words, they saw if we were going to become protectionist and raise our trade barriers, we're going to do the same thing against the United States. and we exported a lot of foodstuffs and raw material and manufactured goods. Other countries raised their trade barriers against our exports, and so we lost as many jobs in our export industries as we gained in stopping imports. So that is sort of a disintegration of the world economy. And to get to your question, the reason why after World War II the United States embraced this idea of freer trade around the world is because the 1930s was a disaster in terms of the world economy. It wasn't just the Great Depression in the United States. Trade relations among countries deteriorated. Every country became much more autarkic, meaning trying to be self-sufficient,
Right.
not trade with one another. And it was an attempt to unwind that because the theory at the time was, the idea at the time was, we can't build a prosperous post-war system, a prosperous post-war world, unless we have a strong economic foundation for it. And the way we can enhance the economic foundation is by having freer trade among countries. So the idea was not just that protectionism had bad economic effects, but it had deleterious political effects as well in terms of exacerbating friction and diplomatic problems across countries. So France and Germany have always been fighting with one another.
Right.
If we can get those two economies together and bring down the trade barriers between them, we can get goods flowing between countries, not armies flowing across borders.
And it worked.
Absolutely. So we established something called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was basically a conference bringing major countries together after World War II. We all agreed on sort of a code of conduct of world trade. We began to reduce trade barriers in stages throughout the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and so on. We reduced those trade barriers. We've seen an explosion of world trade, an explosion of world GDP, and Western Europe, Japan, the United States, the key core countries at this time, became much more prosperous as a result of that.
Fine. Now, here's why you're wrong. I'm giving you the case against free trade.
Sure.
Every year since 1976, the trade deficit. Every year since 76, the value of goods and services that we've imported into the United States, in income and goods and services, has exceeded the value of goods and services that we've exported. Donald Trump, quote, "Our trade deficit is like having a business that continues to lose money every single year. Who would do business like that?" Close quote. Professor?
Well, to judge whether a trade deficit or a surplus is a good thing, we have to sort of understand what's driving it. And so I brought a friend with me, Alexander Hamilton, to help explain this. So here's my Alexander Hamilton, the $10 bill.
Got it.
And so let's say we're in countries engaged in trade. So I say you have some good products. I'd like to buy $10 worth of products. I'm in the United States.
I'll sell you this book for $10.
Okay, there you
Which,
go.
by the way, is a heavy discount. I paid full retail for that, by the way.
Right.
Okay.
Now you have $10. Now you're another country. You can't pay your workers with the dollars. You have a different currency, the euro or the yen or what have you. And I have some goods to offer, this cup here. And you say, I want to buy that for $10. Well, we have balanced trade. We've traded. I gain from buying the book. You gain from getting the cup. But actually what's going to happen is you say, well, of this $10, I only want to spend $7 on goods from you. Now you're left with $3. Well, what do you do with that? You can't use dollars in your own country. It's a different country. You're going to invest those $3 in the United States in treasury bills, in stocks, in land, buying a firm, starting up a firm here or something like that. In other words, the whole balance of payments will balance. We'll get the $10 back, but it may not all be in terms of exports. It's going to be in terms of a capital inflow to the United States. And that's basically what's going on. So I imported $10 from you. I only exported $7 from you, but that $3 still came back to the United States in the form of foreign investment.
And for much of the 19th century, the United States ran a trade deficit, the flip side of which was that on net, foreigners were investing more, putting more capital into the United States than we were putting in capital in those countries, and that built out the interior of the United States. It was British capital that built American railroads, for example, to a large extent, right?
Right, exactly.
Okay, so the flip side, a trade deficit, nobody likes the sound of the word deficit. That's one way of describing it, but an investment surplus is different words for exactly the same phenomenon. Is that correct?
Exactly. So the balance of payments are sort of divided into the what's called the current account and the capital account. The current account is basically the trade deficit. So we have a capital account surplus, a financial account surplus.
Got it. All right.
And just an important point here, the other country then is making a foreign investment. You're running a trade surplus, but you have a capital account deficit because you're making a foreign investment. Japan's been doing that for some time. Japan's had a big trade surplus for many, many decades. its economy is floundering. So running a trade
So
surplus.
trade surplus is no indication of a strong economy. No
Exactly.
necessary indication.
Not necessary, yes,
All
that's right.
Argument against free trade number 2, jobs. Critics argue that free trade has hollowed out American manufacturing, sending tens of thousands of jobs overseas. Donald Trump, quote, "I'm going to bring jobs back from China, Mexico, Vietnam. They're taking our jobs," close quote. Professor Irwin.
We have lost jobs in manufacturing. The share of the labor force in manufacturing has been declining secularly since 1950 or so.
Secularly means long-term trend.
Long term, it's almost a straight line down. And we're not uncommon in that. A lot of developed countries have seen a greater share of their labor force shifting to services rather than manufacturing. In some sense, it's what's happened with agriculture as well in the 19th century. We shifted from an agricultural economy to a manufacturing economy, now to a service economy. Foreign trade has played a very small role in that transition. If you look at, the most important reason for that is because of technology. Productivity advances are so great in manufacturing, we can make more and more stuff with fewer and fewer workers. So the steel industry is a great example. In the 1980s, it took 10 workers to make a ton of steel. Today, it takes 2 workers to make a ton of steel. Now, the import market share has not grown in steel. We're not being besieged.
We're still making the same proportion of the steel that we use in this country. That's the point. Okay.
So it's about 25% now. It was about 25% in the 1980s. So we're not being besieged by imports of steel, but we need fewer and fewer workers to make that.
But that's a good thing because that's how an economy grows. We can make more with fewer people.
Exactly.
Correct?
That's
Okay.
how we fed America with 1% of the labor force. Not 1% of the labor force.
Agriculture became persistently a secular trend, long-term trend, more and more productive.
Exactly. We can feed not just ourselves, but the world, and now with manufactured goods, at least in terms of steel, autos, we have many fewer auto workers, but we're still making lots of trucks and cars.
Wages.
If you could I just back up? Because once again, there's always a qualification.
Oh, all right. I'm trying to leave you exposing yourself, but you're covering all right, go ahead.
Apparel. We have lost a lot of jobs in apparel. Also, apparel output is down. So we are importing a lot more apparel than we did before. We have lost those jobs partly because of technological change, but also because of imports. So when you say imports
you
cost...
write, let's get right to this case. You write in this book that China is a special case, that as imports from China surged, particularly during the 1990s, as I recall, it's through about the early 2000s, isn't that right?
Particularly the period from 2000 to 2007 or 8.
Oh, I see. Okay, so the early 2000s, as imports from China surge, they're concentrated in certain industries, and in this country, those industries were concentrated in certain regions, largely the South, and people, the harm, well, you describe it. How do you put it accurately? People got hurt.
Yes,
They really
absolutely.
did, and it was
Absolutely.
free trade that hurt them.
It was trade that hurt them. We didn't change our policy regarding China at that time. We did extend them permanent normalized trade relations, so we had been giving them pretty good access to our markets before. We made that more permanent around the year 2000. But also what happened is that China joined the WTO. A lot of their tariffs on inputs went down, making their businesses more efficient. They were able to reduce prices and export a lot more than they had before. So a lot of the imports were in apparel, furniture, and those industries got hammered.
And so Donald Trump has a point. We shouldn't have let that happen.
Well, we did lose a couple 100,000 jobs in apparel, but millions of American households got much cheaper clothing, greater variety of clothing. They were able to save a lot of money. And the way I put it once is that we have about 44 million people under the poverty line here in the United States. 44 million. And if they can save $100, $200 on their clothing budget every year,
That's a big deal.
it's a lot of money. And yes, 100,000 workers, 200,000 workers in apparel may have been laid off as a result of imports. But you trade that off against the savings for all these people at the poverty line, let alone everyone else. And you have to think about, well, should we have stopped all those imports and raised those apparel prices and imperiled those households that were impoverished?
All right.
There's some difficult trade-offs that just simple sound bites don't quite get at.
Okay, I'll come back to that. But free trade in American history. Donald Trump isn't the only one who's skeptical of free trade. The founders sought to protect American industry from international competition. Alexander Hamilton, quote, or he's writing of the, quote, the expediency of encouraging manufacturing in the United States From the Civil War to roughly World War I, the nation imposes a system of tariffs, policy of protectionism. Here's Abraham Lincoln, the sainted Abraham Lincoln, quote, "The abandonment of the protective policy by the American government must produce want and ruin among our people," close quote. That could have been Donald Trump. It could have been Pat Buchanan, who writes often against international trade. The abandonment of protectionism must produce want and ruin among our people, close quote. And during this protectionist period, the country grows and grows and grows and becomes the greatest industrial power on earth. Would you like to retreat?
Absolutely not. So I have a forthcoming book next year called Clashing About Commerce, a history of U.S. trade policy. And I go into all these debates and talk about the real economic history behind them. So it's true that around 1860, we raised tariffs fairly significantly. They were high for a very long time after that, and the economy did very well. But we're also a large continental country with internal free trade, a lot of competition. We're still able to import the best technology in the world, so we were always at the technological frontier. It's true we probably didn't trade as much as we would have if we had open trade, but a lot of our manufacturing industries were already well established. And a lot of that growth took place in the service sector. That was the high productivity sector of the period. And so the tariff had very little to do with us becoming a great power in the late 19th century.
Okay,
it wasn't so much a manufacturing phenomenon per se.
So what you're saying is, all right, there was a protectionist policy in place, but if you actually look at the details, the items that were protected, the tariffs, it didn't really matter that much to the economy. It was a small part of the entire economic picture. And I now put it to you, Professor Irwin, that it'd be just fine for Donald Trump if he pursues a, by and large, pro-growth economic agenda, rolling back regulation, rationalizing taxes, cutting the corporate tax rate, all the things he's talking about doing. If the political price of that is pursuing a protectionist policy, which is big words, but actually very little effect on the economy, that's okay. We ought to be able to live with that. Yes?
Well, once again, domestic economic performance is determined by a whole range of factors. So you can fiddle with trade a little bit, but I think a lot of the things you pointed to, corporate tax reform, burden of regulation, those can have a much bigger impact than a lot of other policies regarding trade. Starting a trade war would not be productive, however. It wouldn't enhance, I think, that agenda because we tend to export technologically sophisticated goods, a lot of machinery, Boeing aircraft and things of that sort. And we put those jobs in those sectors in jeopardy because other countries would retaliate if we tried to protect our apparel industry or what have you.
Even before he became president, he said he'd yank us out of the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, right, which doesn't actually involve China. It involves a number of countries on the Pacific Rim and us. And because he campaigned against it and won the election, that's already dead. He didn't have to withdraw us. The Obama administration has chosen not to pursue it, knowing that it would face defeat in the Senate. Okay, good thing or bad thing?
It's a bad thing, but it's not a done deal, a dead deal. Already, members of Congress, Chairman Brady of the House Ways and Means Committee,
Kevin Brady, 8th District of Texas. Go ahead.
Yes, and the Speaker of the House have said TPP is on hold. We think there are important benefits there for the American economy, and even though the President-elect has said we're not going to pursue it, we're going to keep it alive and maybe wait for a more opportune moment or perhaps renegotiate parts of it. So it's very interesting. Will be a very interesting period for trade because usually presidents are the responsible ones, and they're trying to rein in the irresponsible Congress that wants to throw out trade barriers or do this or that. That was certainly the case during the Reagan administration, when he always said, I will veto any protectionist bill that comes from Congress. Congress is the irresponsible party now here. Today, we have a president who's maybe willing to rip up trade agreements or start trade wars, and now it's the leading members of Congress who are saying, wait a second, Congress is now being more responsible. Let's not be too abrupt here.
A couple of final questions, Doug. Here's Pat Buchanan, quote, this is longish, but it says something, quote, in 1985, China's trade surplus with us was a paltry 6 million, not billion, 6 million tiny. Last year, China ran up the largest trade surplus in history at our expense, $365 billion. To understand why Detroit looks as it does, while the desolate Shanghai that Richard Nixon visited in '72 is now the great and gleaming metropolis of 2016, look to our trade deficits. Now, you've already argued that trade deficits can't be responsible for that kind of change. But it's unnerving. Detroit has been laid waste, and Shanghai is a great and gleaming metropolis. What happened?
Well, a lot of things going on there to unpack. But first of all, that's that sort of zero-sum thinking that I think is wrong, that they've gained at our expense. Remember, we're still making a lot of cars and trucks. We're not making them in Michigan. They've gone down south, not to Mexico, but to Tennessee, Alabama, and what have you. So one thing you have to ask about the state of Michigan is, what is it about some of these Rust Belt states where they've allowed manufacturing to flee, to stay within the United States and go to other states that are have different laws regarding unions, different business climate in terms of taxes and things of that sort. So manufacturing jobs have left the North, but they're elsewhere in the United States. That's certainly true with the steel industry, where the steel industry is sort of spread around due to these mini mills. It's not so much due to foreign competition.
And the rise of China? They had to have been taking advantage of us in some way.
Well, let's go back and think about that trade deficit, because here's why bilateral trade deficits can sometimes be very misleading. So what kind of phone do you have?
It's not on me now, but I have an Apple.
Apple, iPhone. So what does it say on the back of the iPhone?
Designed in California.
And
manufactured in China, I think.
It says assembled in China.
Assembled in China.
Assembled in China. So the unit cost of an iPhone is about $150. That's not the retail price. That's the unit cost that Apple declares when they import this from China. It's not made in China. It's not manufactured in China. The camera came from Germany. Microprocessors came from Korea. Other components, software came from the United States. It all goes to China where it's assembled, which is why they say assembled in China. It then comes to the United States and it becomes a $150 import from China. Do you know what the Chinese content of that iPhone is? About $3. But we don't say we just bought $3 worth of stuff from China. We attribute all the value of what the U.S. had exported, was coming from Japan, Germany, to China, because that's the last place it came from. So so we say as a $150 import from China, that's only $3 worth of Chinese content.
It's only $3 worth of Chinese physical content, or the physical content plus the labor contribution. The total Chinese contribution is only $3.
$5, $3, something like that, depending on how it's apportioned. So the whole point there is that when we say that we have this enormous trade deficit with China, we're attributing a lot of stuff to China that's not really coming from China. That means our trade deficit with Germany is a little bit higher because we got that camera actually indirectly from Germany via China.
Got it. All right, Doug, last question. This is you writing once again in Foreign Affairs this past summer. The real problem is not trade, but diminished domestic opportunity and social mobility. You wrote this past summer, but think about states that Donald Trump won that nobody expected him to win. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. The real problem is not trade, but diminished domestic opportunity and social mobility. Technology has shrunk manufacturing as a source of employment. Construction work has not recovered from the housing bubble. And the military turns away 80% of its applicants as unqualified. There are no sectors of the economy that can employ large numbers of high school educated workers. The real problem is we're so productive in manufacturing per person now that we can't employ as many people as we used to. Last question. You are now advising President-elect Donald Trump. What should he do?
Well, what's behind that quote, of course, is work by Charles Murray and Robert Putnam and others talking about if you drop out of high school or just a high school graduate these days, once again, there used to be opportunities for you in the economy.
Right.
And those have been shrinking. Somehow we have to either give those people the skills that make them employable in the 21st century.
So one implication is education. Oh, go ahead.
Well, education reform, some sort of vocational training, a whole bunch of things can be tried there to at least give them the skills that firms want to hire them and what have you. Otherwise, it's very difficult. I mean, once again, many people have sort of thought about what could we do for these workers? What can we do for these people? whether you create make-work schemes, like on the New Deal, WPA, if you can't join the military, there's no manufacturing jobs for you, and housing construction is not at a high level. What are the opportunities for you? It's a difficult social problem, I think, that we're facing this generation for some time. And I don't have.
But the fault is not trade. The blame, ascribing the blame to trade is a mistake.
Once again, we're still producing a lot of manufactured goods here. Okay. It's just we need fewer workers to produce them.
I said that was the last question. I just told a lie. Here's the last question. Productivity, as the country became more and more productive in agriculture, what was it, 1900, 90% or close to 90% of workers were engaged in agriculture, and now it's 1%. We're all richer. Mm-hmm. Everybody understands that. Yep. Manufacturing doesn't seem to be following the same path. Robots come in, artificial intelligence makes machines more and more and more productive. People can't find work. The adjustment is going to be very hard. It doesn't seem to be that there's going to be a smooth adjustment. What do you do? A basic income? Give people money, not 2 years of unemployment or 6 months of unemployment, but $15,000 a year, $20,000 a year, so people can afford to live, and just simply admit that certain sectors of the American population are going to be unemployed for long portions of their productive life. Is that what we have to do? Is that what we're facing?
That's a big problem that we face as a society.
So you buy this argument that actually productivity is happening, increases in productivity are coming so fast that it really is going to throw people out of work.
Once again, we'll create jobs elsewhere to employ those people. I mean, we're speaking late December or mid-December, and the unemployment rate was just announced at 4.6%. So the headline unemployment rate is fairly low.
Pretty good.
But a lot of people have dropped out of the labor force, and the question is how to get them back in. And so here's where the ideas such as the earned income tax credit, where basically for a firm to hire a worker, they have to take in a lot. They have to pay taxes on that worker. They have to pay health care expenses. It's a very expensive proposition. We have to make it cheaper for firms to hire workers. So that means business taxes and things of that sort. But the earned income tax credit is another way that, once again, in a bipartisan way, Republicans and Democrats have both endorsed that. President Obama did, as did Paul Ryan, Speaker of the House. They both think it's a good idea. It's effectively an inducement for people to get work where the government will help them if it's below some standard. It's almost like Milton Friedman's negative income tax.
Right.
And that's a way you can get people at least work experience, which is so important, and get them on the ladder where they could potentially see doing better in the future. Right. But if you're not on that ladder, if you dropped out of the labor force, you have very few prospects ahead. And we can't have that. We have to get people back in the labor force, at least doing something, just so they can support themselves in the future.
All right. Here's the last question. The Trump transition team now is talking about 4%, maybe even a little more than 4% growth within a couple of years. They really seem to believe, or at least they're saying that they believe, that with the economic program that they intend to move in the first 100 days, taxes lower, corporate tax dropped considerably, making it easier for corporations to repatriate money, the economy will roll back regulations, the economy can recover quickly, and there will be growth of the kind that we haven't seen in almost a decade now. Do you buy it? I guess what I'm asking is, are you fundamentally optimistic, or will more and more of America start to look like Detroit?
Oh, I'm generally optimistic about America because, once again, I think there's still huge opportunities. We're a large open market with a lot of capable people. Long run, always bullish on America. Whether you can achieve 4% growth, I mean, think about the Reagan boom in the 1980s. That was after coming off a big recession, and so we had a lot of slack in the economy, pulling people back in the labor force, and we could grow quite rapidly. But right now, as we just mentioned, there are people on the sidelines, but the unemployment rate is fairly low. We've had an expansion for some time, albeit from a very difficult financial crisis. If the growth doesn't come from a lot of people moving into the labor force, it comes from capital accumulation. Well, that means we have to increase our savings rate or really provide some big inducement for investment, or it has to come from new technology and productivity. And it's hard to see where that magically can appear. So I'd be skeptical about a 4% sustainable growth rate, but certainly we always have to be thinking about what policies can we do to improve the performance of the economy and increase economic growth.
All right. Short-term skeptic and long-term optimist, Professor Douglas Irwin, author of Free Trade Under Fire. Thank you.
Thank you.
For Uncommon Knowledge and the Hoover Institution, I'm Peter Robinson.